Hello, friends. Nobody is talking about this. Not the financial news channels that cover retirement planning, not the blogs that track Social Security updates, not the advisors who charge hundreds of dollars an hour to explain benefit strategies to people who can afford them. This particular rule change moved through the SSA system the way most important SSA changes move. Quietly, without fanfare, without a press release aimed at the people most affected, and without anything resembling a plain English explanation reaching the seniors whose monthly deposits it is already changing. But it changed. It is in effect right now, and the seniors sitting inside its reach, and there are significantly more of them than the silence around this change would suggest, are either benefiting from it without knowing why, or absorbing consequences from it without understanding what happened. I found it. I traced it back through the policy language to what it actually means for real people living on real fixed incomes. And I am bringing it to you today because that is exactly what this channel exists to do. Take the things SSA changes without telling you and translate them into information you can actually use before the window to use it closes. Today is about closing that window gap. Stay until the very end, because the last rule change I cover today is the one nobody is talking about most, and for the seniors it applies to, it represents the single most significant shift in how their benefit is calculated that has happened in recent memory. And if SSA Now is where you come when you want to know what SSA quietly did before it quietly affects your check, subscribe right now and turn on the bell. Quiet rule changes happen on SSA's schedule. The people subscribed here find out before the deposit changes. Everyone else finds out after. Let me start with something that matters before we get into the specifics of what changed. The Social Security Administration administers
benefits for over 70 million Americans. The rules governing those benefits, how they are calculated, when they adjust, what deductions apply, what options are available, are not static. They update constantly. Thresholds shift annually. Processing frameworks get revised. Policy interpretations evolve. And the mechanism SSA uses to communicate these changes to the people they affect is, by any reasonable standard, inadequate for the scale of what is changing and the financial significance of those changes to people living on fixed incomes. The result is a consistent pattern. Rules change, deposits shift. Seniors who did not know a rule existed discover it only after it has already determined what they receive, usually through a deposit that is smaller than expected, a deduction they cannot explain, or a correction that should have happened automatically and did not. What I am going to do today is interrupt that pattern for you. 3 specific rule changes, what each one does, who it affects, and what the action window looks like for responding to it while responding still changes the outcome. Here is the first rule SSA quietly changed, and the one that is affecting the largest number of seniors right now without explanation. SSA updated the internal processing standard for how cost of living adjustment interactions are calculated for seniors who have multiple benefit components running simultaneously. This sounds technical, and it is, but the practical consequence is straightforward, and the dollar impact is real. When your annual cost of living adjustment is applied to your Social Security benefit, it is supposed to apply to your base benefit amount, the primary insurance amount that forms the foundation of your monthly payment. For seniors receiving a straightforward retirement benefit with no additional components, this is simple. The percentage increase applies. The deposit goes up. The math is transparent. For seniors receiving benefits that involve
multiple components, a combination of retirement and spousal benefits, a retirement benefit with survivor benefit history, a benefit that has been adjusted through appeals or recalculations, the COLA application is more complex. And in that complexity, SSA's quiet rule change created a processing variation that is producing COLA adjustments for some multi-component benefit recipients that are calculated against a slightly different base than the senior would expect if they understood how the calculation was being applied. The rule change does not affect everyone with a multi-component benefit. It affects the subset of that group where the component interaction produces a base figure that differs from the total benefit amount the senior sees in their deposit. For those seniors, the COLA percentage is being applied correctly, but to a base that may not match their intuitive understanding of what their benefit is, producing an annual increase that feels smaller than the stated percentage would suggest. If your COLA increase this year felt smaller than you expected given the announced percentage, this processing variation may explain the discrepancy. Call SSA at 1-800-772-1213 and ask them to walk through exactly how your COLA was calculated, specifically which base amount the percentage was applied to and how that base was determined given your specific benefit components. Understanding the calculation does not automatically change it, but it identifies whether your situation falls inside a category where a formal review of the base calculation is warranted. Second rule SSA quietly changed, the documentation threshold for earnings record corrections involving work history from before 1978. This is the change that is creating the most urgency for seniors who have been intending to correct old earnings record errors but have not yet acted on that intention. SSA has updated its internal guidance around what constitutes sufficient documentation for earnings.
Corrections covering work history from before the Social Security Administration modernized its record-keeping systems in 1978. Before 1978, payroll records were processed and stored manually, creating a documentation landscape that is already fragile and getting more fragile with every year that passes. Employers from that era have closed, records have been lost, paper documents have deteriorated, and the seniors whose working years from the 1960s and early 1970s may be incorrectly recorded in SSA's system have been operating under a gradually tightening window to correct those records before the documentation required to support the correction becomes impossible to locate. SSA's quiet rule change tightened that window further. The updated guidance places greater weight on primary source documentation, original employer records, contemporaneous tax documents, Social Security card records from the period, and reduces the weight given to reconstructed or secondary evidence that was previously accepted as sufficient support for corrections in this era. What this means practically is stark. A correction that was achievable with the documentation you currently have may not be achievable under the new standard, and the documentation that would make your correction straightforward under the updated standard may still exist somewhere, in an old filing cabinet, in a box that has not been opened since you moved, in records a former employer's successor company might still maintain, but finding it becomes harder with every passing year. If you have any reason to believe your earnings record from before 1978 does not accurately reflect your actual income from that period, a year that seems low, a period of work that does not appear at all, a stretch of employment that you remember clearly but that SSA's record seems to have missed, the quiet rule change SSA made creates more urgency around acting now than existed even 6 months ago. Log in to ssa.gov and open your
full earnings history. Go back to the earliest years in your record. Compare what SSA shows against whatever documentation you have from that period. Old tax returns, W-2 forms if they exist, any employer records you may have retained. If something does not match, start locating your supporting documentation today and file the correction request before the updated standard makes the documentation you currently have insufficient. Drop a comment right now and tell me, have you ever reviewed your earnings record for years before 1978? Because I consistently hear from seniors that they have never looked at those early years at all, and that is exactly the period where the quiet rule change SSA made creates the most immediate urgency. Third rule SSA quietly changed, and this is the one nobody is talking about. The framework governing how SSA handles benefit amount discrepancies that are identified after a senior has been collecting for more than 12 months. This change is the most significant of the three, and the one with the largest potential dollar impact for the seniors it applies to. And the reason nobody is talking about it is that it touches a category of situation that most people do not know is addressable at all. The idea that a benefit you have been collecting for years might be wrong, and that wrong means correctable rather than permanent. The assumption most seniors carry is this: the benefit SSA calculated when they first filed is the benefit they are going to receive. If it was wrong, if an earnings record error or a formula application mistake produced a lower number than they were actually entitled to, that mistake calcified at the point of filing, and there is nothing to be done about it now. The deposit is what the deposit is. That assumption was never entirely accurate. SSA's reconsideration process has always allowed benefit amount disputes to be raised formally. But the practical accessibility of that process, how easy it was to initiate,
how SSA evaluated the evidence presented, and what the realistic likelihood of a successful correction looked like was limited enough that most seniors never pursued it. What SSA's quiet rule change addressed is exactly that accessibility gap. The updated framework governing benefit amount discrepancy reviews modifies the evidentiary standard for disputes raised more than 12 months after the initial benefit determination, specifically around how SSA treats documentation of earnings record errors that were incorporated into the original calculation. Under the previous framework, a senior challenging a benefit calculation more than 12 months after filing was essentially required to demonstrate SSA's error against SSA's own records, a process that placed the evidentiary burden almost entirely on the senior and produced outcomes that reflected that imbalance. Under the updated framework, the internal review obligation shifts, meaning a formal benefit reconsideration now triggers SSA's own responsibility to actively verify the accuracy of the underlying calculation, rather than simply defending the original determination. In plain language, this means that a senior who has been collecting a benefit that feels wrong, who has always had a sense that the number was lower than their working history should have produced, now has a more accessible path to formally challenging that calculation, and a more favorable evidentiary environment for doing so than existed before SSA quietly made this change. The stakes of this rule change are significant for the seniors who understand how to use it. A benefit that has been running $100 per month below the correct amount for 3 years represents $3,600 in cumulative underpayment. If a successful reconsideration results in both a corrected going forward benefit and a retroactive payment covering the period since the discrepancy was formally identified, that $100 monthly error becomes a meaningful financial correction. And the
retroactive component is where the timing of initiating the reconsideration matters most. The retroactive payment reaches back to the date the reconsideration is formally initiated, not the date the error began, not the date the benefit was first calculated incorrectly. Every month you delay initiating the reconsideration is a month the retroactive window does not cover. Under the quiet rule change SSA made, the process is more accessible than it has been, but the clock on the retroactive window runs regardless of when you find out the process improved. Call SSA at 1-800-772-1213 today and ask to initiate a benefit calculation reconsideration. Tell them you believe there may be an earnings record discrepancy in the years used to calculate your original benefit. Ask them to confirm the specific earnings years incorporated into your calculation and the indexed values applied to each one. Under the updated framework, this request triggers SSA's verification obligation, meaning the review becomes SSA's responsibility to conduct rather than yours to prove. The date of your call establishes your retroactive eligibility date. That date matters more than any other single number in this process. Here is what connects everything SSA quietly changed across these 3 rules. In every case, the change moved through the system without personal notification. In every case, it is already affecting seniors whose deposits it touches. In every case, there is an action available right now, a call to make, a record to check, a form to file, a reconsideration to initiate that produces a better outcome than the passive alternative of not knowing the change happened. And in every case, SSA made the change without making the case for why seniors should care about it, because SSA's communication structure was not designed around the needs of the people it serves. It was designed around the administrative requirements of the agency that runs it. That gap between what SSA changes and
what reaches the seniors those changes affect is not going to close on its own. It closes when someone translates what SSA quietly did into what it actually means for the person whose monthly deposit depends on it. That is what SSA Now does, every time. So here is what to do today. Call SSA and ask how your COLA was calculated, if this year's increase felt smaller than the announced percentage suggested. Log into SSA.gov and review your pre-1978 earnings record before the tightened documentation standard makes a correction you could support today impossible to support tomorrow. And call SSA today, right now, before this video ends if you can, and initiate a benefit calculation reconsideration to establish your retroactive eligibility date under the updated framework that makes the process more accessible than it has ever been. 3 quiet rule changes, 3 actions. Any one of them could permanently change what lands in your account. Nobody was talking about this. Now you are. If SSA Now gave you information today that the agency itself never sent you, subscribe to this channel and turn on the bell. Every quiet rule change, every silent policy update, every shift that touches your retirement income without announcing itself, I find it, I translate it, and I bring it here before it determines a benefit amount you never got the chance to verify. And share this video with every senior you know right now. The rules that changed quietly changed for their account too. Whether they find out today or never is often just a matter of whether someone showed them this video.